presenting, feel free to type it in the chat or unmute and ask your question as well. Okay. All right. So let's get started. Are you all seeing my screen? No.
No.
Or can you share your screen? Yeah, good. We're seeing.
Am I
Yes.
seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So as I mentioned, my name is Tithi Basu Mallik. I'm the Assistant Director for Graduate Students, Professional Students, and Postdoctoral Support at the University of Kentucky. I work primarily with graduate students to help them in terms of all of their career needs, whether they want to go to a career in industry, in academia, in other fields, whatever the case may be. If you have any career questions and if you're a graduate student, come find me. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about interview preparation. How do you prepare for an interview? Interview preparation, of course, starts way in advance of when you actually sit down for an interview, right? So we are going to talk about that preparation process. We are going to talk about some categories of questions that you might encounter and you might not be sure how to answer those. We are going to talk about having a framework or a strategy on how to answer questions. And we are going to talk about some tools and resources for interviewing. All right. So even though I work primarily with graduate students, I was aware that some of you might not be graduate students. So the content in all of this should be applicable to undergraduates as well. All right. So first, as you get started about interviewing and thinking about interviews, you might feel a sense of dread, right? You might not know how to approach it. You might not know how you're going to answer the questions. The starting point, like I was mentioning, you have to start thinking about interviews a lot before you actually sit down for an interview. And it starts with really evaluating what you bring to the table. What do you bring? Like, what's your unique value proposition? Why are you a good fit for the organization or the role that you're applying for? So this, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Okay, not anymore. Thank you to whoever that unmuted and muted themselves. So articulating to yourself what your strengths are, what your values are, what your skills are, is going to be very valuable, right? This could be very different. Let's say you are an international student. What do you bring to the table, right? You might think, oh my gosh, I am constricted because I have to ask for a work permit. There are work permit issues that I have to grapple with. There are tons of other things that I have to grapple with. But do not underestimate that you bring to the table tons of unique things. You know, you're very well versed in intercultural communication, and that's a huge strength. You might know multiple languages. That's a huge strength. You might know how to, if you're international, you have practice, you have moved to a different country, and you know how to get accustomed to the cultures, all of the things that surround moving to a different country, the customs, the culture, the language, all of it. You have navigated all of that. So you are nimble in that way, right? So highlight all of your things. Think about what differentiates you from somebody else and really focus in on that and figure out how you're going to communicate that to a potential employer. What really makes you valuable to a potential employer, right? Is it the fact that, okay, you have all of these degrees, all of these education? Is it that you have had an internship? Is it the fact that you know how to code in Python? What is it that makes you valuable? If you are not able to articulate it to yourself, you'll have a harder time articulating it to an employer who wants to hire you, right? One of the most common questions you might encounter during an interview is, okay, why should we hire you? What makes you unique? Or some version of this. So it's important to articulate your own value. So, like I was mentioning, you start preparing for an interview way in advance. What do you do for interview preparation? You start by understanding that there are different types of interviews, right? For interviews, you might get a phone call, so you might have a phone interview. What is becoming more and more common in this day and age is you oftentimes have recorded interviews. What that is you'll be sent like a pre-recorded set of questions and a link, and you'd be required to sort of go through the whole module and record your answers, your responses to those questions, and send that back. In some cases, you have the option of pausing the recorded interview mid-record and redo it. In some cases, you might not have that option. This often throws people off because when you're actually having a conversation with somebody, whether it be on the phone or whether virtually, you get some kind of feedback, right? You can tell from the tone of their voice or their body language, if it's virtual, like how they're feeling, there is some feedback. With a recorded format, there is no feedback. So it often will throw people off. So the only way to circumvent that feeling of nervousness around a recorded format is to practice. If you do a lot of recorded interviews in advance, you'll feel more comfortable with the format, and you wouldn't be thrown off by that format if you encountered it. Next is, of course, virtual. We are all used to a lot of virtual communication in the past couple of years. So this is no longer as mystifying as it used to be. So virtual interviews often more and more are taking place as final interviews. And in addition, finally, you have the in-person interview where you actually go do a site visit or go to like a faculty job, an all-day job. You go to campus, you get to visit the place, you get to know the people that are there, the teams, the different stakeholders, all of that, right? So how do you start preparing for the interview? Of course, you get confident talking about yourself. If you've never talked about yourself and the first time you're going to talk about yourself is at the interview, chances are you're going to fumble a few times and you're going to feel self-conscious and you're going to think about, oh, I said too many times, or oh, I don't know, am I overselling myself? Am I underselling myself? So the only way to be able to circumvent that is to be able to practice. Practice makes perfect. So practice out loud, practice in front of a mirror, practice with some friends, get a practice interview done with a career professional. There are also recorded interview recording softwares where you can record your responses to interview, and I will key that in at a later slide, but make use of that. That's a free resource available to all of you. Researching is, of course, a very key element of preparing for an interview. So you have to research the employer, the role that you're applying to, who are some of the people that you'll be working with, what are their backgrounds, what kind of career trajectories have they had, what kind of a role will you have, what are the values of the employer? If it's an academic institution, what's the mission statement of that institution? You have to do all of that background work. And why will that be valuable in terms of when you interview? Because then you can pick out some keywords, right? And use that when you provide and deliver some answers in terms of your responses when you're interviewing. You, of course, want to thoroughly review your resume or your CV before you actually sit down for the interview. You want to know, you do not want to come across as being unprepared or you've forgotten something that's in your CV or your resume. That's a huge red flag. If they say, oh, this thing that you did in retail, tell me about it. And you're like, oh, which one? Or did I do something in retail? That's a huge red flag. So do not be that person. Preparing for the interview requires showcasing your competencies in a way that it relates to the role. You might have tons of experiences, right? But they might not be relevant to the role. The challenge for you, the task for you is to be able to showcase how your skills, how your experiences prepare you to serve well in that role. So make that connection. And in advance of the interview, you absolutely want to ask, okay, what kind of an interview is this going to be? Is it going to be virtual? Is it going to be like on the phone? How many people are going to be there in the interview? Is it going to be one person? Is it a one-to-one interview? Is it 5 people. Who are the people that are going to be interviewing me, right? Is it going to be a bunch of faculty members? Is it going to be HR? Is it going to be somebody that's a domain expert? And your preparation for the interview is going to depend based on who your interviewer is going to be, right? Think about it. If the person that you're interviewing with is an HR, the kinds of questions you can anticipate are going to be vastly different from if the person interviewing you was either a domain knowledge expert or a faculty member, right? So it's important to understand who the interviewer is. In addition, if you know who the interviewer is, you might be able to make some educated guesses about the kinds of questions you might get asked, right? If you know that somebody is a domain expert and knows a lot about molecular biology, let's say, you can anticipate questions in that domain. If you know somebody is, let's say, a domain expert on toxicology, you can anticipate questions in that domain. So knowing the background of the research of the person that you're going to be interviewing with can be very valuable for you. Do your research on the interviewer, use your detective skills, right? Go and look up what their background is, who they are, what their education is, what's been their career trajectory, all of that. But mind you, when you're interviewing, do not overshare, right? Do not say, oh, I did some research on you and I know you have a cat, right? There are some fine boundaries. You do not want to overstep those. You don't want to come across as creepy, even though you might know that. And you might have found out about that in the process of doing your research. So be mindful of that boundary. So in terms of interviewing, we think some questions in particular are tough. Can you all give me some examples in the chat of what some tough questions are that come to mind for all of you? If you want to unmute, you're welcome to unmute and shout out the question, of course.
You said, what are the tough questions or why?
Yeah, what are some questions that you all think are tough? Like you have encountered and you're like, oh, this is a really tough question.
I had one question before. They asked me, how do you convince people about the importance of diversity, or how do you kind of educate people about the DEI, important DEI issues?
Okay. And what was it about this question that you found tough? Why was it tough?
Personally, I think I just don't have that kind of experience. I feel like it's some kind of because I was unprepared.
Okay. All right. So lack of preparation or not being able to anticipate the question, you just weren't prepared, you didn't have a rehearsed answer. That's what can make some questions feel tough. Whitney said in the chat, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years? Okay, Whitney, why is that question tough?
I think it's probably tougher more so now, just with everyone kind of living in this world of the pandemic and a lot of the job turnovers, job flux, and really trying to figure out what's worthwhile for them in this kind of changing dynamic.
Right. And it's so hard to anticipate where things are going to be. I can see that. Okay, so yeah, there are some questions that are going to be tough. And it's very important to bear in mind that there is no way you're going to be able to prepare for all of the questions that you will ever get asked, right? You can make a list of 10, 20, heck, even 100 questions. You will probably encounter a question while you're interviewing that you haven't prepared for, right? So it's better to have a strategy on how to approach interviewing than to try and rehearse the answer to each of the questions. So that's what I say. Think up a strategy, come up with a strategy and utilize the strategy rather than try to rehearse everything. Okay, are you all seeing my screen or no?
Nope. Yes, no.
Okay, thank you. So when you get asked a question, people often feel like they have to dive right in, right? you got a question, you got asked a question and you dive right in, and midway through you're like, oh no, where was I going with this? So then you start fumbling and you try figuring out where were you going with this. Instead, a better approach is to really pause and say, okay, I haven't really thought about this. Can I have 10 seconds to think about it, 20 seconds to think about it? That's completely fine. It's better than starting with an answer saying, oh, that was a really terrible example that I started giving, and then trying to recover from that. So always take some time and think about where you're going to go before you start. Have a structure. It's very important to think in your head, okay, this is how I'm going to introduce this, then I'm going to talk about it, and this is how I'm going to end. So have a beginning, a middle, and an end to your response. That really will help you navigate how you start answering the question. And when you get asked a question, ask yourself, why is the interviewer asking you this, right? What is their motivation? What are they really trying to get at? What do they want to know about you? And this is helpful for all question types, right? What is the real motivation? What are they trying to understand about you? So let's look at some concrete examples of what I mean by this. So let's say there is somebody is asking you the question, what is your greatest weakness? What is somebody actually trying to figure out about you? We all have weaknesses. There is nobody who has no weaknesses. They're like this perfect being. What are they really trying to understand? They're trying to understand, are you self-aware? Do you know what your weaknesses are? And if you do, have you worked on them? Is the weakness something that is going to get in the way of doing the work, right? Let's say I work as a psychologist and my weakness is that I hate working with people. That would not really work. That wouldn't really be a good fit for the job. So they want to vet out those types of cases. Something in the chat. We cannot see your slides.
Yeah, we're seeing negotiating a job offer. Is that what you want to show us?
No.
Okay.
Okay. What? Let me stop share. Technology. I'm sorry, and this is predominantly my fault. What are you all seeing right now?
Not seeing your screen.
I don't know. My slides have quit on me. Sorry.
You're fine. So you're able to share, right?
I should be able to share. Are you all seeing anything now?
No, we don't. We're not seeing anything.
Hold on.
Let me make you a co-host to see whether that helps or not. They
Okay, I'm the co-host now. What is happening?
Yeah, we're seeing your screen. Structure
Okay.
your responses.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, all right. This is where I was. We were talking about decoding some concrete examples. We were talking about what happens in case you get a question like, what is your greatest weakness? People want to understand how your written weaknesses really, whether that fits in with the role or not, and whether you are self-aware or not. What about if you get asked a question like, do you prefer working independently or as part of a team? What they're trying to get at is really understanding, does your work style match the type of projects the role requires, right? Some projects, some jobs are going to require really solitary work, right? Where you just go do the work alone on your own. And if that is really your style, then you're going to be a great fit for the role. Some other jobs are going to require a lot of collaboration. And if your style is that you really prefer, you'd rather work alone than you'd work on a team or with people, then you're not going to be a good fit for the job. That's what they're trying to get at, really. What about a question like, tell me about a time when you had to manage conflict? What are they trying to understand? There's something in the chat again. Okay. All right. So they want to understand, are you able to handle conflict? Because no matter what workplace you're in, you're going to have multiple coworkers. You're going to probably get into some situations where everybody doesn't agree with each other. There's a way to be able to handle it maturely. Are you able to do that? How do you handle that? That's what they're trying to understand. So trying to understand what people's motivation are behind asking you a question is oftentimes very helpful in beginning to answer that question in an effective way. So broadly speaking, this is of course not an exhaustive list, but broadly speaking, some types of questions are behavioral questions. You sometimes might get asked case-based questions, right? Where they give you a concrete example and they're like, here's a case, how would you solve it? In addition, you also encounter technical interviews, which really requires you to use all of your technical knowledge and skills and expertise in answering those questions. And then there are many other types of questions. So something that people report having a lot of trouble answering are the behavioral interview types of questions, right? So let's dive into behavioral interview type questions. These questions, you might encounter them if you're in the HR round of the interviews. You might encounter them in other scenarios. So an example of a behavioral interview would be, tell me about a time when ... you found it difficult to work with a team member, or when you had to deal with conflict amongst team members, etc. Another example could be, give me an example of a time when you had to learn a new skill in a short period of time. That's a behavioral question. Share how you overcame a tough situation, or share how you overcame an error that you made. Also behavioral questions. So how do you approach these questions? The general rule of thumb with approaching behavioral questions is to use the STAR method. The STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. And some of you might be familiar with these 4 elements, but an element that I like to add personally is the additional R. So STARR is the STAR that I say you should go for. And what is the remaining R? The R is relate. The final R is relate, and that really talks about relating it back to the job. You start with, when you're asked a behavioral question, make sure to start with describing a situation. Give an example. What was the situation that you encountered, right? When you found it difficult to work with a team member, what was it? What was the situation? What was the context? What was the background? What was the task at hand that you were trying to accomplish? Why was it difficult to work with them? What was the action that you undertook to overcome the difficulty in working with the team member? What was the result of the action that you undertook? Did it resolve in both of you figuring out and going and doing things differently? What was the result? And then relate it back to the job and say, this will help me in my role as a data scientist because it will help me interface with clients, and it will help me navigate working with clients, communicating difficult information to clients, or something along those lines. So as I was mentioning, start with the situation, define the task, the action, result, and then relate it back. Any questions so far? If you have questions, feel free to unmute.
I think we have a question from
Okay.
Priya. She said,
Okay.
can you answer tell me about yourself question? There's so much we can say. Is it appropriate to ask which part of me would you like to know about?
That I would not, I'd be careful about saying which part of me do you want to know about. I would really try to tailor your answer to the role, right? If you're applying for a role as a chemist, try to talk about your background in terms of chemistry, particularly if you're applying, let's say, to be a particular type of chemist. Maybe you're applying to be a chemist in the pharmaceutical industry. Talk about any internship you have done that's related to pharmacy. Talk about your educational background, all of that. So try to relate it to the role. But Priya, that was really funny. If I was an interviewer and you said, like, tell me which aspect of me you want to know about, that'd be really funny. That could be a nice icebreaker. I cannot recommend it on a clear conscience because it might be perceived as very sassy. But yeah, if you ever do take that approach, I'd be very interested to know how that goes. All right, my slides are now not progressing. Come on. What is happening? Oh, thank God. All right, case-based interview. So the problem oftentimes with case-based interview is you get an overload of information, right? They're going to say, here's all of these things are happening. There are lots of moving pieces, right? What's a way to be able to handle a case-based interview well, particularly if they're not actually handing you a piece of paper? You have to listen carefully, right? And if you're unsure that you got it right, when you're answering, paraphrase. Take notes, take like extensive notes while you're listening to the question being asked of you. And if you're not sure that you actually got it right, ask clarifying questions to make sure you're not just assuming something. So that's oftentimes helpful when it comes to case-based interviewing strategy. When you start answering, think through the answer before you start answering, right? Propose a thoughtful approach to solving the problem. Think about, are you actually responding to the question that they asked? It's much harder to give a rehearsed answer to a case-based type of question. So really engage with the question you are being asked. And instead of getting bogged down in the details, sometimes it's helpful to like take a pause and think about, okay, what's the big picture here? What are they actually trying to ask you? And as a final piece, always try to summarize what it is that you try to contribute as an answer to a case-based type of question. Is there a question? Okay, I'm going to move on. So there, if you're looking for samples, you can find tons of case-based interview examples online. If you also go to our interviewing platform called biginterview.com, you should be able to find some examples of case-based interviews. Technical questions, of course, those are aimed at asking you and assessing your proficiency, your level of expertise in a technical domain, or in a domain that you mention that you're going to work. So how are you going to prepare for technical interviews? Make sure to brush up on your knowledge, your skills, right? If you read something in the first year of graduate school, and you're applying for a job that had a line item in there, say you took a class in, let's say, robotics, right? And you haven't done anything related to robotics in years and years, but it was on your resume. So if you put it on your resume, make sure you're brushing up and you know some of the basics of what you're, because you can get asked questions about things that are on your resume. Ask the interviewer that would it be okay to ask you clarifying questions. It's not always possible to be able to give the best answer to technical questions on the spot. So if you feel like you haven't put your best foot forward, don't fret too much about it. Do the best you can, answer the question, show your work. If this is like work that you have to show, if this is math that you have to do, show your work. And don't always feel like, you have to know the answer, you have to be able to do it. Sometimes, this is not true in all cases, but sometimes what they really want to see is whether this person has the humility to be able to accept that, no, I don't have all of the answers. Sometimes that's very helpful. In addition to all of these, keep in mind that some questions are actually inappropriate or illegal, depending on the state where you're interviewing to ask. No interviewer can ask you questions about your marital status, your relationship status, all of that. About your family life. Do you have children? Are you a citizen? There are tons of questions like that. So before you interview, depending on the state that you're interviewing, do your research, figure out what questions are they actually allowed to ask you, what can they actually not ask you. I hope none of you encounter illegal or inappropriate questions, but if you do encounter them, what can you do? Say somebody asks you about your marital status or your relationship status. It is perfectly fine to say, I don't feel comfortable sharing that, or I'd rather talk about my credentials and my qualifications for this job than about my personal life. And like I mentioned, what question is going to be illegal depends from state to state in the United States. So do some research. All right. Finally, I already mentioned this resource called Big Interview. Log into Big Interview. This is a subscription-based resource, which means that the university has paid for all of you to be able to access this resource. This is a pretty solid resource. Once you log into Big Interview, you will be able to see tons of question banks that you can choose from with respect to practicing. Practice those interviews. And another great feature of Big Interview is that you can record yourself and you can get AI feedback, right? So recording yourself is great, but it's even better if you get some feedback on your recorded responses. So we have AI feedback integrated into Big Interview, which will, for example, say that, oh, you use the word like a lot, or you didn't make a lot of eye contact, or you did this, etc. So make use of Big Interviewing as a resource. You can also get a practice interviewing appointment with any career advisor at the Stuckert Career Center. All you have to do is make an appointment through Handshake by logging into uky.joinhandshake.com. All right, so now let's go to the questions. What questions related to interviewing might you all have?
Before we go to question, do you mind sharing these two links you shared? One is example of case and the other is the Big Interview, so that
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Let me put that in the chat in a minute, as soon as I pull it up. If there are any questions, please let me know.
I can start with a question, maybe two questions. The first is, we have international students and domestic students, and we know that sponsorship is a big issue that international students have to navigate. So when and how to let your employer know I need sponsorship? How to, let your employer know that. And second is, I believe, at least me, I'm always nervous every time there's an interview. So especially when you talk about this star strategy, how do I handle that if I do not have direct experience with that? For example, if they ask me, tell me in time when you're having a difficult client, and I'm not working in a bank or anything, so how do I approach that kind of question?
Those are great questions. Thank you. All right, so let's start with the first question you asked, which is that international students often are wondering about work permit, etc., visa sponsorship what is the best time to approach that? The answer is that there is no one-size-fits-all strategy, right? In tons of cases, you will, when you're applying for jobs, you will already encounter a question that says, will you now or in the future require visa sponsorship? And that's oftentimes a required question. So you already mentioned that before you even proceed to the interviewing stage. In that case, it's safe to assume that they know about your international status. Now, some people take the approach that this is something, work permit is something that I will need if I'm going to be able to work for this employer. So I'm going to just say from the start that I need work visa sponsorship. And if the answer to that is no, fine, I'm going to move on to the next person, right? Now, think about it this way, right? Taking that approach, not everybody's life circumstances are the same. People have different things going on in their life. People have different privileges. So some people might not be able to put themselves out there before they have had the chance to showcase their skills and they're fit for the role. Because the reality is, even if an employer says, no, we don't really sponsor people for these kinds of roles, if they really like you, they can make a few things work, you know. So it's up to you. Do you feel like you want to take the stance that you're in a position in your life to be able to take the stance that this is something I need? So I'm going to be transparent about it from the get-go. I'm going to say it in the first round, in the phone interview. I'm going to make sure that they know I need work visa sponsorship. If the answer is no, fine, I'm ready to walk out. That's an approach you can take. But maybe that's not the approach for you. Maybe you're more comfortable showcasing the value that you bring to the table and then negotiating after you have an offer on the table, you know, what they can do for you in terms of providing work visa sponsorship, because in that case, you actually have leverage, you know that they like you, right? So it's going to be easier at that stage. I'm going to go to your next question now, which was that what happens in case you get asked a question like your experience working with a client? You have never actually worked with a client, right? This is where it's helpful to take a step back and think about, okay, they're actually asking about a client, but what are they really trying to understand? Is it my ability to work with people? Or is it my ability to communicate with somebody who's not from my discipline, right? Is it about understanding like interdisciplinary communication or my ability to be able to communicate a very specific domain knowledge to somebody who is not from my field? Or which of the two is it? If it's that, you know, you are able to work and communicate with people in broad spectrum, you can use an example of when you actually maybe taught. Or if it's about interdisciplinary communication, you can give an example of something else when you had to work on a multidisciplinary team. And it's perfectly fine to ask a clarifying question and say that I don't really have an experience at this point where I have worked interface directly with a client, but I have worked with many people when I was teaching, or when I worked in my lab and we collaborated with a different lab who had a different set of expertise. Does that answer your question? All right. There's a question in the chat from Renata who's asking, if you don't receive a response from the recruiter a few days after the interview, is it okay to email them? This is why when you're interviewing, it's always a good idea to ask, what is the timeline, right? Absolutely make sure when you're interviewing to ask the interviewer some questions. Don't let them off the hook, because as much as they're interviewing you, you're also interviewing them to figure out if they're a good fit for you, if their work culture is going to be a good fit for you. So absolutely ask them questions. And one of the questions that I recommend you ask is, what is the timeline for hearing back? Right? If they say the timeline is a couple of days, then yes, after a couple of days is passed, you can email them and ask for an update. If they say the timeline is a week or a month, I would not recommend emailing them back and saying, hey, do you have something for me? Have you made a decision? I wouldn't recommend that in that case, Renata. So it really is going to depend on what their timeline is. Of course. Other questions? So I dropped a link to the big interview tool, and you can all log into that using your link blue and your password. I dropped a link to Handshake, which also you can log into using your link blue and your password. Any other questions? You can type it in the chat, or you can also feel free to unmute and shout out your question. What was the most challenging question I got in an interview? Are you asking me or? Okay, you're asking me. What is the most challenging question I got in an interview? I have to think about that. I think one of the questions that I found challenging, this is probably not objectively speaking challenging, and it was challenging more so because I wasn't prepared to feel that question, was about my pedagogical approach. This should have been a pretty easy question, but yeah, it was not a role that was focused on teaching. So I really wasn't anticipating a question related to teaching. But I think part of the reason why that question came up was because I have done a lot of teaching in my life. So I can see why they would want to know about my pedagogical approach in general. But because it was not a question I had absolutely anticipated, I was very thrown off by that question. That's something that comes to mind for me immediately. In general, I think people find it challenging to talk about their weaknesses. That's something that people often struggle with. They report experiencing challenges around saying, okay, what's your biggest weakness? I would say that. And I do have a tip to share about how to answer the question about your weakness, if you all are interested in that.
Sure, please.
All right. So my tip for approaching what is your biggest weakness question is don't try to spin a positive into a negative. That's something that people often do, right? Take something that is actually a positive about yourself and say, oh, this is my biggest weakness. I'm too much of a perfectionist. I spend too much time, doing this or that. Do not do that, because your interviewers have tons of experiences. Oftentimes they have interviewed many people and they can see through it when you're being disingenuous. So do not be disingenuous. Really think about something that is actually a weakness about you. Identify that, right? But don't pick something where you're like, oh, my biggest weakness is that I'm really lazy. Pick something that you have identified and you have actually worked towards improving. So say you have identified that you are not the greatest at public speaking, let's say. And because you identified that, you decided to fix that about yourself, and you, let's say, decided to enroll in Toastmasters, which is a way of improving public speaking, or you signed up to lead a lot of workshops in your lab about rotating papers. You decided to give a lot of seminar papers to be able to overcome your fear of public speaking, right? Saying something like that, A, shows you're self-aware, B, that you have actually identified it. And once you identified it, you took some concrete steps to try and overcome it. So that is oftentimes very valuable, and what employers that is something that will give you some extra brownie points with an employer. So that's my tips on how to approach that question of what's your biggest weakness.
Thank you for that. I do have one question. Before I say that, so if you are okay, please fill out the survey, and then we will give out 2 gifts for tonight's participant based on the, I mean, not based on the what you said on the survey, but your participation of the survey. So please do take 1 or 2 minutes to do the survey. So my question is, you mentioned earlier about, well, people ask you about some question that you weren't prepared, and then I mean, of course, I mean, if you won't prepare, it will be not a perfect answer. So is it another way to make up for it? For example, in an email, is it good to do that? Or is it, I don't know, maybe you can share your insight.
Yes, absolutely. So Renata, going back to your question, see how I did that? I wasn't entirely prepared for your question about what was the hardest question I faced. I went back to it. So Renata, going back to your questions, one of the more difficult questions that I have been asked is how I utilize my humanities background to help students across all disciplines. Again, a question that I wasn't really anticipating, and I said I was going to think about it. I said something on the spot, but I recognized it wasn't the best answer. So I said, I'm going to think about it and I'm going to get back to you. And after the interview concluded, I emailed the person back, thought about it some. I emailed the person back and said, I had a chance to think about it, and I think I can contribute in X, Y, and Z way. So yes, to answer your question, Yan, it's absolutely okay to email the person back and say that, yeah, this is something I thought a little bit of time. I took a little bit more time to think about this, and this is how I would approach this problem, or this is how I would do it. That's actually absolutely fine. And that actually shows that you're really invested in the process and thinking about it and took the time to actually email them after the interview was over. So yes, it's perfectly fine. Feel free to do it. All right, everybody who enters the survey will be entered for a giveaway. That's awesome. I encourage all of you to do it. All right, any other questions?
I have a question, but that's a little different than the interview aspect. So as you mentioned earlier that you are here to help students get into the industry, into the job center, so how, I know you may be basically just for the grad students, but how you can help with the postgraduate students who are like me from the internationals?
You mean postdocs, right?
Yeah.
Oh yes, so I misspoke. I'm here to support graduate students and postdoctoral students. So postdocs are absolutely welcome. So if you're a postdoc, I know you are, Namrata. So yes, feel free to reach out to me. My job title is Assistant Director for Graduate Students, Professional Students, and Postdoctoral Scholars. So yes, absolutely. Reach out to me if you need any help.
Yeah, because I'm just in the middle of my J1 visa. It's 2.5 years I'm already gone through.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm trying to, in the middle of the road, trying to see where I have to go, choosing the academia after my visa over, and choosing to the company or industry. So yeah, I'll be definitely in touch with you for that.
I dropped my email in the chat for those that are interested in emailing and reaching out.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And thanks for pointing out that I misspoke and said I'm here just to help graduate students. That is not the case.
No.
Graduate
I think
students
you
and
said, yeah, no. I think you said that, but I just think that most of the time, because for us, international students, I think there's a different person, like Joseph. You must be knowing him. Yeah, so Joseph is there for but we have seen only him, we got the emails from him only. So I just I just had this in mind that maybe you're more focused upon the graduate or the undergrad student. So in that way, I was
no, absolutely. There's a fair basis to your question. So Joseph, to clarify, is the director of postdoc affairs. So he is more of the overarching postdoc person, which is great that there is an overarching postdoc person. I am focused on career
Yeah,
career.
so he's not like, he just take care of the overall affairs of
Yeah.
the postdocs with the
Yeah,
university
so
and
all of your
everything.
papers, making sure you're signed up in different classes. Like there's only one class that you all are registered in, I think.
So
but
we really don't have anyone who is like career oriented, from which we can take help from. So that's a
well, you
little
do.
different.
That's me.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. Yeah. Thank you. I'll be in touch with you. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Yeah. No. Some questions about the form. Any other questions? Any last question before we conclude the workshop? People are having questions about the form.
The form asks, what did you like the most about the program event? Okay, only numbers.
Okay, Lashana's on it.
Lashana, okay.
Lashana's on it.
Okay, good. Okay.
All right.
So I guess we're all very satisfied with your presentation, and it's very helpful. Thank you very much for taking your time helping us navigating interview process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. And if you can share the registrants with me, that would be very helpful because I need to enter it on my end for data purposes as well.
Sure. Yeah, I will share with you the check-in from my end, and for all of you. And Lashina, we're going to email you to finish the survey, and then we will pick up 2 people for the give outs, 2 gifts. And Lashina will be in touch with you by tomorrow. So please keep an eye on your email.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining today. And thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you all have a good rest of your evening. Bye.
Okay, bye.